How you doing, guys? Eric from rulthewasteland.com. Got a new mic now, so let me know if this is working, if you can hear me. Looks like it's working on my end. I could not make it yesterday, sorry, because of Freedom Day, July 4th festivities and whatnot. Just couldn't get it done. Sorry, I couldn't get back home in time. But I wanted to do today's, lots going on, and I wanted to at least specifically give away the prizes since this is the first live stream of July. And I don't have next month's prizes here with me, so I'll tell you about them. They'll be good, I promise. They're always good. I'll tell you about them on the next. So let's give these away real quick. Cool. Tim and Mr. Landfill says they can hear me. So let's open up our number picker. And I think we got to go up to, we're just going up to 107 this time because there's not the extra bonuses. So this is going to be for the main prize, or is the K-bar trail point. So let's see what we got. See if we can share screen. All right, you guys seeing this? Let's spin for it. Oh, I gotta remove all these. There we go, 107. All right, here we go. Let's see what we got. $57. 57 is Mark S. 57 in there. Mark S. Congratulations. I think you were only in for one. So it just shows you that even the low tier guys, you might win some awesome prizes, including this one. So next up, next prize, Trade Old Timer Honing Steel. All right, here we go. That one is going to be $66. That is Dennis C. Dennis C. So Dennis C has won the Trade Honing Steel. And the last prize before getting the live stream is the bush rag / ghillie suit, size small. Let's do it. $62. Wait, 62, sorry, is looks like John H. John H. You've won the, so I'll email you guys or message you rather on Patreon for the winners to get the shipping address. If it's different than what you need on there, just let me know. So congratulations to free stuff, guys. Free stuff. Mr. Landfill says hi everyone. So this week has been, I guess, a couple weeks rather, in the last few weeks. We'll try to make it so that, sorry, might have to, getting worse, man. I'm getting old. I gotta use my Clark Kent glasses now. But yeah, congratulations to the winners. I don't have the prizes for next month here. They'll be just as good. So I'll let you know in the next live stream, but just get on the Patreon. You can see that even someone who only had one entry still has a pretty decent shot of winning something and just won tonight. But lots of going on in the international news type of community. And we talked a little bit about some of it last time, but as is the case with the current affairs these days, everything, so much stuff is happening that I could probably do a live stream every day talking about something. The biggest ones, um, or the biggest news in between then and now is with regards to Iran and Israel. It's become very clear for a bunch of reasons that I don't think that this is going to be a one-off. This ceasefire after what appears to be a fairly ineffectual bombing of the nuclear enrichment facilities. I think it was just so that it gave an excuse to like have a ceasefire just so Israel could re-up on their air defense. Now, I don't, like I said, I don't think I'm not of the opinion. I think it's kind of stupid to think that the people who think Iran was like absolutely kicking Israel's ass without too much trouble. They were taking a fair pounding of their own, but the fact is that they were managed to deliver some blows of their own that were becoming fairly damaging. And we were really getting close to the point of them actually not being able to stop the missiles. And they actually hit some military sites. We obviously Israel's doing a complete information blackout. I don't trust anything I hear from them. You can't trust anything you hear from either side in terms of whether the information is true or not. But just in the amount of information that they've given us. So, where was it? The Israeli media outlet Haaretz has reported that the U.S. military used 93 THAAD interceptor missiles in 11 days to defend Israel, revising earlier estimates by others of $800 million to an actual cost of approximately $1.2 billion. With an this is the most important part to me, with an annual production rate of roughly 36 to 48 THAADs interceptors, the United States used nearly 2 years worth of interceptors during this so-called 12-day war, at a cost of $1 billion. So that's one of the new elements of going forward into this five, six, whatever generation warfare we're in now. Specifically, I was talking to someone, I think on Twitter about this, specifically with related to the drones, is, when you bring up people's shipbuilding capacity, like China, I mentioned to many people like that China has something like 200 times in tonnage the shipbuilding capacity of the US at the current point. Like the Russia, Chinese, North Korean, Iranian kind of group, they have more manufacturing capability for most of these things than the US in terms of their artillery shells, blah, blah, blah. And it's because we have a higher GDP and everything else. But people will bring up the claim that, oh, well, these are all cheap Chinese junk. These ships are not equal. So even if there's 200 times as much, it won't matter for some reason. I'm like, whatever. But you know what that doesn't matter for, and what China specifically, because that's going to happen sooner or later anyway, is uniquely well suited to do is produce extremely cheap one-use drones, like cheap consumer electronics, like drones and little computerized electronics of any kind. You cannot compete with China right now. Like nobody makes that stuff in the US because it's just impossible to compete with their production of those type of things. So when you have all these drones, which is like that is what makes the difference now is drones. And it's up to, I think it was Canadian Prepper that had the chart that showed that there's something like 500 or more drone attacks every day now in like the Russia and Ukrainian war. And China is in a unique position to be, I wouldn't be surprised. This is just a number I've totally pulled out of my ass, but just based on what I know about what I do know about their production capacity and everything, I wouldn't be surprised that when it comes to those single use drone type electronics like that, I wouldn't be surprised if China could outproduce the NATO like 500 to 1 in terms of just churning out these drones. They're the only one who already makes any of that stuff for the most part at like a retail level. And they could just switch all that capacity over to just producing it for the military, and they could probably have millions of drones like produced every year. Millions. It would be my guess. Like I said, I don't have a source for that. So that's bad news. And we're getting into a point with this fifth and sixth generation of warfare where the um the shields are more expensive than the sword, so to speak. So like you can have these Houthi missiles that they make out of well, not the Houthis, but the Houthis actually must have pretty good missiles if they're shooting them all the way from Yemen into Israel. That's not a short trip. But even just like the Hamas rockets that are made out of water pipes and stuff, if they still have to use an interceptor to shoot any of those down, you're talking about a rocket that probably costs them a few $100 or something to maybe $1 million for an interceptor. And if some multiple countries, if countries like Pakistan and stuff are serious about supporting other nations against Israel, it could get really bad for them fast. And there's a zero chance that the U.S. doesn't continue to get dragged into this, especially, and this is the other recent black pill, especially considering what we've seen recently with the Epstein releases and how it's just completely transparent that they are going to cover for whatever's actually going on there. And for those of you who don't know, they basically came out and said, with the Justice Department, it wasn't directly released by the government yet, but I think it was Axios or somebody, and they haven't denied it. Basically, they reported that the Justice Department is saying that there was no Epstein client list, and he killed himself, and they have footage of a hallway with a timestamp to prove it, which I posted on Twitter even before that happened that that's what they were going to do. When they said they have video evidence that he committed suicide, I was like, there's just going to be some video with a timestamp, and they can make I watched a video of a Yeti, you know, the AI videos what I'm talking about, where these Yetis do like video logs, YouTube channels. So you can't trust video anyway, and even the video that they do give us is meaningless, even if it was 100% real. So it's obviously they're not going to go after, or for whatever reason, they're covering up for that whole situation, which means that we are way more under the control of Israel than even I, who's pretty black pill in that respect, even I assumed. And then even today, right after, pretty much the day after it's released that there's nothing to see here with Epstein, Netanyahu swings by to give Trump a Nobel Peace Prize nomination. Okay, sure. And during this meeting, he also says that we're going to continue to give more weapons to Ukraine. So World War III is on 100%, and it's going to get really bad in terms of financial and supply chain disruptions and stuff like that eventually. It'll probably take some time because it's not really going to get hairy until we get into direct conflict with China and Russia, which at this point seems like it's all but guaranteed. I would say it's at least like 75% likely that we end up in direct conflict with either Russia or China or both. It's most likely going to be both. And because of the things that I recently stated and the fact that this is coming at the exact moment that we're headed for an extremely severe economic crisis with our currency and debt, that yeah, it's not going to be fun. It's not going to be a good time. S. Wheatley says, "Isn't today Monday?" It absolutely is. And even though I don't normally know what day it is, this was done knowing that it was Monday, simply because I couldn't make it yesterday. And I wanted to make sure I at least gave away the free prizes, which I did at the beginning. If you're watching later, you can go back, or if you're watching just tuned in, you can go back and watch it later now. So I'm not planning on moving away from the Sunday night. I just missed yesterday because of July 4th festivities and couldn't get back in time. But I wanted to jump on here. So what do you guys think? Obviously, I think the plan for prepping hasn't changed, other than just the certainty that it's going to get a lot worse with regards to international conflict and domestically with economic troubles. We've seen, I think we're seeing more and more kind of commentators coming out and saying that they expect things to get relatively bad relatively soon. Now, it depends on the split is between people who think that we're going to see more of a kind of run up before some kind of crash versus a crash first and then a melt up, which has always been the way I have foreseen it. But I mean, we could very well see a short term kind of mini melt up. We're at like all time highs in the S&P and everything, but it's just so hollow. There's just no real strength there to anything in the economy. It's all fake. The numbers are fake. The money's fake. Like everything is just fake. Everything is at insane valuations. Buffett indicator and everything is just everything's flashing warning signals. I had a chart that I just showed a buddy of mine it showed the when stock markets are at these levels of valuations and price to earning ratios and Buffett indicators and stuff like that, in the past, your return for the S&P 500. So if you were to get into the markets when the levels were like this in the past, you would get, and then it showed what you would expect to make over the next 10 years, depending on when you entered. And when you entered, when the valuations were like they are now, you actually got nothing over the next 10-year period, like absolutely nothing. Tim Butler says, "My faith is in Jesus. I shall not worry about end times, wars, and rumors of wars." Well, you don't have to be worried, but you should still prepare. Yeah, it wasn't necessarily the debt to GDP ratio, but that is, I don't think it was, but that is obviously a huge problem too. And the debt's not going to go down. We're seeing people openly, I think Gregory Mannarino had a video on this either today or yesterday about the article from, I think it was Market Watch, where they're openly talking about it was something like half or more of all financial commentators are now expecting there to be some kind of, there's going to have to be a restructuring of US debt. And restructuring is putting it nicely because it could be a very involuntary restructuring. I do think I've never bought that the government and the Fed and all these don't know what I know about this stuff, even though um they're obviously making the decisions that I think are very wrong. I think they're doing so with the knowledge that they're eventually going to have to face these things in one way or another. I think they're just going to planning on doing it in a way that, like they've always done it in the past, it keeps them the most power. Um, that pilfers as much out of the system at the last minute as possible. And yeah, like Google account says, there's going to have to be a massive correction. And the only way we can really avoid it, or avoid it, deal with it, is to make sure we're not in those assets that are going to correct. And I think the market, I'm not telling people not to be in the markets, but just the dollar denominated assets in general are going to get wrecked. Yeah, we could see a devaluation, but I think what I think is more likely is actually a currency switch of some kind. Because like I've talked extensively before about how we're never just going to see an outright default. That would just destroy the system in ways that would take a lot of their power and a lot of their options from them. And there's a reason no other fiat country in the past, fiat currency system in the past has really ever done that because there's no advantage to it if you're the people that are in charge. Either way, you're going to have to face hardships and restructuring and austerity of various kinds. But if you just outright default, then you're in a basically a debt-based fiat system. Your money just disappears literally from the system. It's just gone. So you can't do anything. Can't pay your military, can't pay your politicians. You can't even buy anything yourself. So they're not going to do that, but it's a form of default still because you're just eliminating the purchasing power from the existing currency that everyone holds. Um, and they're just going to, yeah, it'll be some kind of new CBD dollar, some digital dollar. I really do think it'll be backed by something, at least in name. If whether that's effectively, gives it any real value or not remains to be seen. But since the restructuring will probably come on the back of everyone, even normie level, you know, people who aren't even in markets and stuff, but every citizen in the United States is probably going to be a point where they realize that the system is having problems and the currency isn't worth anything. So you can't just come out and say like, well, this McDonald's gift certificates are bogus, but we've reprinted these new ones and they'll be worth um, the same thing. No one's going to trust it anymore. You have to make it new or novel or in some way at least rationalize why this currency has value to it when you literally probably months before this have destroyed the previous currency. So what they're going to do to fix that, I think, is just back it by some sort of commodity. But it won't be gold, or at least not directly in gold. There's zero chance it will be redeemable in any like realistic sense for the average person because a lot of people would just do that right off the bat. But yeah, it'll be some kind of Fed coin and it'll probably be backed by something like oil or a basket of commodities because if you used to have a dollar that's backed by oil, it kind of prevents normal people from cashing it in while still giving it a value. And you can still control the amount of oil in ways that you can't really control the amount of gold, especially with a country like the US that is a big oil producer that gives us something that we have that not everyone else in the world has, that everyone knows we have, that's still very valuable, but also isn't really going to be subject to a run in the sense that, like, even if people don't really trust a new currency, if it was redeemable in gold at any local bank, a lot of people would just be like, you know what, that's fine. I'll just go ahead and just hold the gold from now on or for the time being and not need these new gold dollars. But if it's oil, you can't do that, even though they'll be like, don't worry, it's backed by this commodity that has actual intrinsic real world value. It still makes it just by awkward logistics not really able to be redeemed because you can't just go like, yeah, no, I'll take my quart of oil instead of a Brent crude or a West Texas crude or whatever. So that kind of gives them a way of bypassing it actually being redeemed on a long scale, on a large scale, at least at the retail level, while still being able to say, hey, this is actually represents a real tangible commodities that have a real value. And it does. Oil absolutely does. Energy does. Yeah, but the scary thing about obviously about the any sort of digital currency is all the weird stuff that they can do with it. They could geofence so that you can't spend it in certain areas, or so it's worth less or more in certain areas. You could obviously get debanked. We've seen plenty of people who get kicked out of banking companies and websites and everything for their thought crimes. Um, Right. And so you can't buy if the government thinks that it's important that Israel has all the gas masks filters, for example, then all of a sudden you can't buy them with your Fed coin. Or only people in these areas can, or with these clearances, or with this special rating on your account. Yep, and you could do all sorts of stuff. You could put negative interest rates on it if they want to juice spending and say everyone right now, anything that's sitting in your account, it loses value. So you better go spend it, or vice versa. And they can just do it very, very liquidly. But the point is, you still have to have, they can't just say we're switching to this new totally fiat currency after everything else is destroyed, because people will avoid it for the most part, especially other countries. Even though people in the country wouldn't necessarily be able to avoid it as easily, they still would. We see that in other countries, South American countries all the time, where people really don't use the local currency. Like in Venezuela and all these other places, they use dollars from other countries' currencies, or gold, things like that. So they still have to have a reason. But with it being digital, if they start out with it being without any shenanigans, they wouldn't do that stuff right off the bat. You know what I mean? They would wait until it was entirely ensconced and everyone was in the system, and it would be convenient in a lot of ways. That's, like I mentioned before, that's the problem with a lot of this tech, is that it's not all bad. There are things about like these that are make life way better, way easier in certain respects. And then once everyone is using it, now you can't live without it. And all they need to do is very small things to kick you out of normal, life completely. You can't even log into some other random website if you don't have your phone operational to get the third party or a two-factor authentication text or something. Appreciate the super chat. Bright Eye Security says, what's the most likely big event with everything going on now? I still think it's obviously to impact Americans, financial. There is increasingly as we go on, especially now with, like I said, with them saying they're going to give more money to Ukraine, which means if they're continuing to support Ukraine, it means NATO troops eventually. And I've always said that was the only way that Ukraine could ever win. That Russia has basically defeated Ukraine already. That they're now fighting with NATO. They've defeated the Ukrainian army. It's only NATO resources are there, with the exception of the actual troops. They're running through the last with Ukrainian troops now. So it doesn't matter how much money they send into Ukraine, or even how many munitions, really, unless they will still lose if they don't send in NATO troops. So if we can tell that they're dedicated to just dumping any resource in, then eventually they're going to send NATO troops in there. So obviously that opens us up to all manner of actual World War III type things. I still think a direct attack on the U.S., contiguous U.S., not just U.S. bases or aircraft carriers, stuff like that, but actually like us here in the U.S., that's low. But there could be all sorts of stuff done with like cyber attacks and electrical grid attacks, things like that, infrastructural attacks. And that's very likely if we actually get into direct war with China. China unleashed, or not unleashed, but showed it's been around for a while now, I think, but one of these weapons is specifically designed to take out power plants, to fry them. Obviously all the drone attacks that I was talking about, and their unique ability to mass produce that kind of thing. And Russia just has or just released a few things that are like following our satellites around. So they have the ability, and they destroyed one of their own satellites a couple years ago in a demonstration. So they have satellite killing technology, which could take out all sorts of internet and communications technology and everything. So all that stuff is on the table. But I still think for us, most likely economic. But multiple things could happen at once. So that's what I think is. But I don't like the chance of actual nuke or something, or bombs going off in the US are pretty low. But if we get into direct, literal war with Russia and China, that could happen. Absolutely could happen. Lost Trail says Mexico revalued their currency in 93, made one new peso to 1,000 old pesos. Right. And that's not really doing anything other than just a step along the way of the death of one of these fiat currencies. And the only way that those type of countries can kind of get away with that is because there is still a functioning financial system globally, where a lot of these people just, yeah, that exists, that is their currency, but they will use other things. Like they have the cryptocurrencies, they can use US dollars to kind of supplement the way that this system fails. But when the dollar basically is that global financial system now, so when that fails, like you can't have any real fiat currencies in the way that they're currently being done. And I think that's really what the BRICS is about. People think of it as, or are too often thinking of it as something that's trying to replace the dollar. And I don't think that's the case at all. They're really just setting up an international infrastructure of people who are willing and able to work outside the dollar. And that does not necessarily require a singular alternative currency that's going to become like a world reserve currency. What they're doing most often now is just having all the BRICS countries set up or bilateral trade agreements with the countries that they trade with most often. Because when you think about it, most countries are not like the US and China trading with dozens, if not hundreds of countries in various ways. They'll have one or two big trading partners that take up a huge percent, at least 80-20 of their trade. And it'll be for one or two things, like Iran's oil or Colombia having coffee and maybe cocaine or something, you know what I mean? But these countries will have a few things that they really buy and sell, and only a few countries that they buy and sell to. So if they set up deals with those countries to just use their own currencies, that allows them pretty big leeway to get out and not really be subjected to the restrictions of the dollar system. And as the more and more that the US tries to clamp down and punish people who do that, the more it actually incentivizes, because they're saying, like, you know what, it's either basically live in the prison or go out and have the animated contest for freedom, where we might have to, find our own food, find our own electricity. We don't have automatic three hots and a cot, but we don't aren't subject to the whims of the guard just beating us whenever they feel like it too. If I say something wrong under this ever-changing system of rules, or we don't have to bow down to Israel and all this other stuff. So that's what BRICS is. It's not really about, like, yeah, sure, I'm sure they put some thought and effort into, is it possible to make a singular new reserve currency, but that's not necessary. And especially, like I've always pointed out, is that the dollar can fail without there being a backup. You know what I mean? Like the BRICS nations just see the writing on the wall. Whether or not they're successful is irrelevant. That's not going to save the dollar when that system is dying. Like I use the example of a bridge, connecting two villages over a river. You don't have to, like, you might be building a rope swing and everyone's like, I'm not going to swing across, like it doesn't have to be better and take people away from using the bridge when the bridge is going to collapse eventually. When it does collapse, people will use the rope swing. It might not even work. They're going to find a way. They'll come up with slingshots, and it'll be a lot worse. And that's, I remember with one of the discussions with, I think it was JJ, where I was pointing out that I was like, I think China will be in a better spot than the US at certain points in the midterm future, but not because they're going to be better off than they are now necessarily, because I think every country will be brought down. The standard of living worldwide will be brought down quite a bit when this system really starts to suffer the effects of it, faltering. Um, so just because China will be ahead of us in some ways doesn't mean that they're going to be better off than they are now. I think we'll all be, just like everyone in that analogy, both villages will be worse off when that bridge collapses. There'll be some people who are more able to get some things across the gorge without the bridge, but that doesn't mean they're better off than they were with the bridge there. So they're not necessarily in any rush to destroy the dollar system. They just see the writing on the wall. They see how heavy-handed the US has been with using that system, like they did, just kicking Russia off, kicking Iran and all these countries. The first thing they do is all these financial sanctions, because they purposely set it up that it's very difficult to operate a modern country and a modern commerce without using that system. They did it on purpose, and it's the first thing they rug pull you with if they don't like you. Lost Trail says, I think gold-backed stable coins running on top of decentralized ledgers could dethrone the dollar. Like I said, I don't necessarily know if they will dethrone it or not, but because like I said, just because they move above it eventually, and in that sense, I guess dethroned. But it could certainly be just because nothing changed and then the dollar broke and people look for the next best thing. It doesn't have to be better than what the dollar has been for years, you know. If you take gold out of the world, people are going to use the next best thing. If gold didn't exist, they would use silver. If silver didn't exist, they might use copper and brass. Even though they're not quite as good for the various reasons as to use as a currency as gold, they would be used if gold disappeared. And that's definitely going to happen with crypto. Even I just doubt, like I said, I don't think we need to see, I think the exact opposite is going to happen. In fact, I don't think the death of the dollar is going to result in an instantaneous rise of one replacement. I think it'll cause a huge fracturing where people jump into all sorts of anything that they think can hold their value. And then some of those will be cryptocurrencies, and which I think just because of the logistical element of it will be the first benefit the first to benefit from that, because everyone can just, the systems are there, they're working. You can conduct commerce and business and trade with the existing crypto infrastructure. So they're obviously going to be something that people use right off the bat. Now, whether or not that is what people continue to use 10, 15 years down the road, you know, who knows? Bright Eye says, what a lead back secure currency. We already have green tipped ammo. Joking. It's not a joke, but yeah, just commodities, just real stuff. And that's the biggest thing to focus on here, is that no matter what we're talking about, whether that's bottle caps in Fallout or tally sticks that you've etched into, or Federal Reserve notes, or even, like I said, even the gold, is that most people, the intrinsic value of gold is that it functions very well as a currency, but it's still used to almost nobody just wants gold because they need to use gold. They like it because it provides all the functions necessary to use to be a good currency, indivisible, or it's divisible, it's not counterfeitable, it's relatively rare, easily identifiable, all that stuff. And it provides a price discovery mechanism for trade. And so when you're using it, you're still using gold to get other things, to get food, to get services, to get wood, to build a house, to get, the other metals that you actually use in construction. Gold, people don't use up gold, barring very few industrial processes and stuff like that, like in space stations and whatever. So people still using gold to represent other things. So any of those other things are going to be okay. Any commodities, land, especially arable, like food producing land, human labor and skills, doctors and stuff like that, at least until AI takes over, will still have value. But we just know that gold is always going to be useful as a currency. So that's why it's good to store that, because you don't always know what you're going to need and when you're going to need it. And a lot of those things can't be stored effectively in any sort of amount. Some of us can't always just go out and buy farmland. You can't move it. There's carrying costs associated with some stuff like that. And things like iron and aluminum are very hard to store significant amounts of. You know what I mean? Like, you could have $100,000 in gold fits in your hand. $100,000 in aluminum bars is going to fill up your garage. Um, so same with copper and things like, obviously, and other things like oil. You can't really store it. Food, it's hard to store. It has a shelf life. Medicine, same. But we should all have that stuff too. Plutonium silver certificates. Now, that does bring up a good point. Not necessarily plutonium, but energy. Energy is one of the core things that is needed and valued by humans. And it is impossible to have a prosperous first world country that is low energy. So energy is a huge one. So uranium, oil, natural gas, all that stuff. It's just hard to, like I said, for normal people to like store that, but you can own stocks in the companies, things like that. And yeah, as Google points out, silver is much more useful as an actual commodity than gold. Industrially, it has way more uses. It's used in all sorts of electronics, and yeah, it has antimicrobial and purifying effects, stuff like that. So that silver is actually used up, like effectively. It's not literally used up, but it would be the cost that it would take to recover most of the silver that's used in consumer electronics. It would be so expensive that silver would probably have to be like $10,000 an ounce or more to bother going into landfills and trying to get that small amount of silver back out of these things. So silver is actually consumed in a practical sense. So that's why and it has the currency kind of, or the properties that lend it to being good as a currency metal too. and it's sort of linked to gold in that respect. So in that sense, it's even, and it seems to be undervalued based on historically and the natural ratios, and because of how much it's used and it's the fact that it's consumed. So I still love silver, still my favorite. But just like with the aluminum, I mean, if you have millions of dollars or even tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars that you're trying to store, you can silver is can be logistically difficult because it's not that expensive still, even at almost $40 an ounce after premiums and whatnot. $100,000 of silver is still more than you're going to carry around reasonably if you need to bug out or something like that. So I wouldn't go all into silver. And it's much more likely that gold is used in some sort of various currency that they come up with in the future and things like that. So gonna get weird, but nothing changes for us. Appreciate you guys watching. Any last minute questions? I wanted to back the US dollar in radioactive metals. Nobody wants to take delivery as much because lead suits are heavy. That would be funny. Have a the plutonium dollars. That would be great. Redeemable for one picogram of the uranium that Iran likes. The uranium, what is it, 235 or something? But they're definitely trying to get their hands on that stuff, that's for sure. So it's gonna be weird.